Hello and welcome to another edition of the Pink Sheet's Pharma Regulatory Podcast. I'm Derek Gingery, a senior writer at the Pink Sheet, and I'm joined by fellow senior writer Sarah Carlin-Smith and executive editor Nielsen Hobbs. We're recording on April 8th, 2021, and hope you've enjoyed spring break and are ready for a spring and summer ramp-up of not only vaccinations, but also FDA policy news. First up today, we take a look at the emergency use authorization process that helped the U.S. gain access to 3 COVID-19 vaccines in record time. Sarah, you looked at the once largely unknown pathway that became a household phrase and how the experience could affect FDA thinking once the pandemic ends.
Yeah, I've been interested in sort of thinking about this pathway and kind of the regulatory processes of it for a while, particularly because when COVID first started, I remember doing stories and you just couldn't find anybody with like pharmaceutical expertise that had a lot of experience with the emergency use authorization pathway. Because for the most part, if you look at the data, it's pretty much been used largely for medical devices, in particular diagnostic tests. COVID has clearly changed that. It still gets way more use in the diagnostic testing front than anywhere else, but we've certainly seen a number of drugs and obviously most notably, perhaps in many ways, the vaccines go through the pathway. So it seemed like this was sort of the first test, I think, or major test of the pathway, if you will, because most of the other EUAs for therapeutic or vaccines have ended up kind of either being for pretty narrow populations or just kind of, a potential need for an anthrax vaccine for the military is very different than a vaccine that's you anticipate, everyone in the world wanting. So sort of spoke with a lot of experts about, what have we learned from this experience and do you expect kind of that to change this pathway, and got really a lot of very interesting responses. I mean, some of the highlights, I think, are just that people are questioning whether, a vaccine versus a drug versus a diagnostic test versus a personal protective equipment and all those different whether all those things really should have the same standard. Obviously, our listeners know that the standard to get a drug approved versus a medical device is, and under FDA's traditional pathways, are often very different, and there's different pathways for different types of devices, and a generic drug goes through a different process than a brand drug. So I think that was one thing a lot of people were hoping to explore. Some people suggested for vaccines in particular, maybe we really need to carve out a separate standard if we're talking about vaccines like the COVID vaccines, where you are anticipating it's going to be given to large numbers of healthy individuals. Other people brought up, whether we needed to think about, the EUA pathway was sort of conceived of in the post 9/11 world where there was a lot of fear around bioterror, nuclear attacks, things where you're just never going to be able to normally do the same types of research you can do in an infectious disease setting because it just won't be ethical or reasonable to do that. But in a COVID type scenario, you can do good quality trials if you put if you put the effort in. So feeling like we really need to kind of clarify that, for settings where you can do certain types of clinical research, we should be doing that because ultimately, even in an emergency situation, you need those kinds of answers. So anyway, it's a pretty dense piece, so I don't want to keep going on and on. I also looked at kind of the flip side of that, of the discussion of how COVID maybe will change the EUA pathway to just how COVID in general and the EUAs issued may change FDA. So thinking more about, what has FDA learned from kind of going at this EUA speed that could maybe be applied to its, non-emergency actions. Which is really interesting. I mean, one point I found we're thinking about, and I'd actually heard some other bioethicists talk about this earlier in the pandemic too, is that there's always a lot of pressure from patient groups to get drugs for their particular disease area out faster. And so how much will people seeing FDA move so swiftly with COVID impact what people expect from FDA in other disease areas where they may not be infectious, but for the patients that have them, the diseases are rapid, they progress fast, there's no treatment options. And, will that kind of lead to another wave of pressure for how the standards FDA thinks about in other parts of its field? So
yeah,
that's
no,
sort of
so,
the highlights. you have to really dig in to read all the answers. Otherwise, I'll be here all day. But
well, Sarah, that's it. That the last part there was one of the things that I picked up on too. Is that and I start thinking abstractly about public health emergency, and they've talked about calling smoking a public health emergency, and I mean you could really stretch that definition, which would could theoretically open this kind of pathway to to other things. I mean, I guess that I guess I'm wondering how long before somebody comes up with the idea of saying like, hey, cancer or heart disease is that's a public health emergency. I want an EUA for this, instead of just to get it to get things going a lot faster, or to get it out there a lot faster. I mean, whether that'll happen or not, I don't know. My guess would probably be no, but it's certainly something that I think people are going to start thinking about.
Right, and I think that's where some of the people I talked to said that this really comes down to a big kind of public health communication challenge in many ways for FDA and other parts of the government to kind of explain why we have the traditional FDA approval pathways, or why we have, accelerated approval, or any of the other mechanisms outside of an EUA, and what they're doing for patients, and why, the kind of the trade-offs of EUAs versus other approvals. I mean, I think it's easy to focus too on the vaccines for COVID, which are, I think most people see as very successful examples of the EUA pathway, and forget about some of the very high-profile examples where a lot of people think FDA did not maybe make the best decisions, such as in the drug space, hydroxychloroquine, convalescent plasma. I mean, even when remdesivir was given an EUA, I think a lot of people were concerned about some of the data or the design of the trials there. So I think FDA has a big sort of challenge ahead of it to explain to people, why we do need, certain types of clinical research to approve medicines, that, just getting, I mean, it's the same thing FDA went through with right to try, and goes through in a lot of situations, that just, sort of pushing something out there because it seems promising isn't necessarily to the benefit of patients. And I mean, that was one thing Jesse Goodman really emphasized with his comments on the EUA experiences, that we really need to make sure that regardless of what we do, we ensure that we preserve the ability to find out somehow whether a treatment works or not, and what the safety profile is or not. And sometimes if you move too quickly to get it out there in a mass way, or to market it formally, you take away any ability to get that clear answer. And I think that's the big trade-off FDA has to figure out how to deal with and communicate. Then you have other people like former FDA Commissioner Mark McClellan, and I think his concern is not so much with all of these various pathways and thinking about it in that way. His concern is more thinking about, can we just change the system so we just get the better evidence and get the better evidence faster? And so he has ideas that I think come from a slightly different perspective, but his thought process is, maybe everybody can sort of be happy if we can just get the high quality evidence faster. And, he talks about, could FDA have been given some authority in this pandemic to sort of have more control about what trials did or didn't get done, so that you make sure, I know Janet Woodcock has kind of complained about this at different points, that you don't have, 100 small trials that are going to lead to kind of inconclusive results because they're too small. So there's a lot of different, I think, ways and kind of different people that come at the issue from sort of different philosophical approaches where you could probably come up with things from this EUA process to both sort of speed drug development and get patients therapy sooner without actually compromising some of the like data quality that other people want.
Well,
Sorry, go ahead, Derek.
I was going to say, and we saw that with the vaccines. I mean, those trials were done correctly and quickly, and we got evidence that was overwhelming. It was, and there was no question on all three of them, really. I mean, there's proof that they're able to do this. It's just a matter of, kind of the, stopping that initial kind of what we saw, that first kind of wave of, okay, everybody jumped in, kind of head first and said, and just started initiating things because nobody knew anything about what worked and what didn't work. And, if there could be some kind of more organized way, maybe, from the beginning, that would have, that's kind of like one of the big lessons learned from all this.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, Sarah. That's kind of, as you noted, sort of kind of encompasses sort of kind of the whole of the philosophical debate around what a regulatory agency should do and how it should do it. And it's great to sort of use this the terrible pandemic to sort of kind of to try and address those questions. And we'll put all the links to the stories in the show notes. But it's a 3 story package, and one of them is this really interesting infographic that, as you mentioned at the top of your discussion, sort of notes that diagnostics have always been sort of kind of used in the EUA pathway more often, but especially now with the various COVID tests, we had to sort of make a whole separate circle of those because it didn't sort of fit in our standard chart format for that infographic. Just sort of kind of driving home that point, and it'll be interesting to see how this all shakes out in terms of sort of kind of what direction the agency heads and which direction sponsors head. If you look at remdesivir, sort of, they did everything right, you might say. They sort of got the EUA, and now they've got full approval, and still sort of people seem unsatisfied with the data. So it's hard to say that sort of even when all the boxes are checked, everyone can be satisfied, but there needs to be some way to move forward on that stuff.
And also, I seem to be the one that always seems to harp on this, but I mean the speed factor. Everybody loves the fact that these were all done quickly and correctly. And I think people are in for a reality check. Once we kind of get past this, whenever that is, hopefully sooner rather than later, where the FDA is going to say, okay, we're going back to the way things were, at least, somewhat. And we're not going to work 7 days a week. We're not going to work 24 hours a day. You're not going to get responses in an hour instead of a week, and there's going to be this kind of big shock, snapback kind of thing going on because they just can't handle the speed and the pace that they're going right now long term. I mean, it's not sustainable. I mean, you hear that over and over. This is not sustainable.
Well, it's also, I guess it's not just the FDA side of speed. The other thing that, for better or worse, helped some of this along was just the nature of the outbreak, right? When you have so many people getting sick fast, or concerned about getting sick, it's easy to enroll large numbers of people in clinical trials. Obviously, we know from other disease areas, just the enrollment is such a huge challenge. So you just can't expect, if you have a rare disease, that a company can, snap its fingers and get, even a few hundred, never mind, the tens of thousands of patients that of people that really were interested in participating in these vaccine clinical trials. So there's going to be speed issues on, multiple fronts that impact, how fast industry and the FDA can move in other areas.
No, that's absolutely true. So we're going to stay with Sarah for this next story. Federal march-in rights for drugs have been controversial for years, especially as outrage over drug prices grew. Sarah, so it seems like the pharmaceutical industry is in favor of this in the latest twist here.
So they're in favor of a last-minute Trump-era rule that would have pretty much made it impossible to use march-in rights in a situation where the reason for that was because of the price of the product. There's been a debate going on for a while as to whether the Bayh-Dole Act, which kind of says if a government invention that was licensed is not available to the public on reasonable terms, whether the price of the product sort of includes reasonable terms. There is this camp that basically says, which includes the drug industry usually, that, if it's available, that sort of satisfies the law. And there is sort of a camp that feels like if a high price makes it, in theory available, but not really accessible, that doesn't. And so pharma got a lot of what it would like to see in terms of changes to how the Bayh-Dole could potentially impact their business and their patents in a regulation that was issued at the very beginning of the year. The question now is, what does the Biden team do with this? They could essentially just drop it, but it seems like a lot of people feel like they can't just totally stop this process at all because there was so much time invested in the run-up to this rule being issued. And I know a lot of the sort of pro-lower drug costs groups that kind of push back on industry and its prices are optimistic that they can just get this rule written. On the other hand, pharma is actually pushing for it to be stronger than initially it was written. Both pharma, the big capital P pharma lobby, and the bio organization as well. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Obviously, the current HHS secretary, which isn't in charge of this rule, it's a Department of Commerce rule, but HHS sort of gets a formal review and sign off on it, if you will. So we know that the current HHS secretary has been one of the Democrats more willing to think about invoking March-in rights when a drug is priced higher than people think makes it accessible. And Vice President Kamala Harris has talked about this before in her political career. But we've also seen Secretary Becerra, I think, pivot a little bit, or at least shy away from promoting that idea so much in his nomination hearings. So it'll be interesting to see if Democrats kind of change their tune on this issue in the Biden administration. Do they revise this rule, get rid of it overall? If nothing else, I just found it interesting, like the degree of sort of interest and attention both sides are bringing to it makes you think like, this issue is either coming to a head or not going away.
Yes, Sarah, I think you made some really good points in your story about how the COVID situation sort of kind of cuts both ways for pharma here. It sort of kind of could sort of put a warm glow on their requests because people are grateful for the vaccines and the pharmaceutical interventions to address the pandemic. But it also highlights how much of that was sort of kind of as a result of government research and funding, be it sort of directly through Operation Warp Speed or sort of indirectly through the NIH and the development of all the basic science that sort of kind of contributed to the mRNA vaccines earlier on. And so, it just goes to show that sort of kind of even as pharma sort of kind of maybe winning some sort of public relations battle that sort of kind of that almost sort of kind of opens new avenues for attack on them.
Well, there was also the report that came out recently about saying that the remdesivir's the federal taxpayer funded research on remdesivir didn't actually produce any patentable discoveries. So because I know that was one of the products that they kind of latched onto as like, hey, the NIH did all the work on this, and then pharma swooped in and took it to market. But that kind of you wonder if more of those types of reports are going to start emerging, or analyses are going to start emerging, and people are going to start wondering if while the basic research itself is very important and a lot of these drugs don't get developed without it, if these kinds of arguments can keep happening over, whether it's pricing or, whatever other,
right.
areas.
Well, some of the areas this proposed rule deals with is kind of how you can determine like what work kind of that was transferred over from the government, like I guess counts as like what work counts as sort of a company funded invention versus a government funded invention. I'm probably botching some of the language. It gets very legal and technical, but those are some of the things in debate in this rule that would then impact like future determinations of kind of who did the work and who has the patent rights and all that stuff. And that's even more complicated than just like the general concern I've heard about, like, while Marchand sounds nice in theory, usually most drugs have, a handful of patents. Certainly a vaccine or a biologic is probably going to have many key patents. So if the government was just sort of responsible for one aspect of the invention, what leverage is that in this kind of situation, and how does that work? So it's certainly like an interesting topic in the drug pricing realm, but it gets pretty complicated quickly in terms of, as you mentioned, Derek, and how many cases and how many drugs, even though the government may have had some hand in it, would it really be possible to use this particular tool?
Yeah, I want to be at the court hearing where they try and argue that, there was like one patent that the government is responsible for and 50 other ones that they're not, and how they resolve that whole thing.
The government should do something like contract with firms that do ANDA litigation, and sort of kind of that the firm can get a percentage of the government sales if they're able to sort of get the patent win those patent cases.
Yeah, there you go. Finally, today, we're going to take a look at the FDA's popular pathway for quick oncology drug reviews and how not all oncology divisions at the agency are on board with it quite yet. It turns out that the oncology divisions in CBER have yet to adopt real-time oncology review, a pathway developed by the FDA's Oncology Center of Excellence to speed some of their drug approvals. RTOR is open to supplements and some NMEs now, and a CBER official said the other day that they are not using the program in part because inspections are complicated. He added that CBER did not believe that RTOR would necessarily speed up the applications themselves, even though CBER still works closely with OCE on application reviews and clinical trial requirements. Now, granted, biologics are much more complicated than drugs, which is that's a given, but I still found this interesting in part because there has been all this talk about making products outside of oncology, available for this program, and there's a lot of enthusiasm about it and people wanting to use it, and yet not even all the oncology divisions at FDA are using it quite yet.
It seemed like a big aspect to why they're not using it in some places in CBER was the manufacturing complexity, that perhaps if you have a product where the manufacturing is so key to the review, and that commercial scale up isn't ready yet, you just can't speed certain things up.
Yeah, it certainly would warm the industry's heart to sort of hear FDA emphasizing that the process is the product, but right. The flip side of that is we're going to that the process can delay the product approval, so they have to worry about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is an issue that when breakthrough therapy kind of first became widely available, that that there were manufacturing questions and a lot of warnings from the agency to make sure that the manufacturing issues were taken care of early if you're going to try and use the pathway and so forth. But this is just one of those things that you don't expect to hear, and all of a sudden it kind of pops up and you just kind of do a double take that, we could potentially see this in use for a lot of drugs and still not see it in use for some oncology products.
Well, I think you're right, Jared. That's sort of kind of the CBER oncology products, given their gene therapy or cell-based therapy issues would sort of seem like poor candidates for sort of kind of something that sort of kind of is supposed to move that quickly, given sort of how novel they are. And have you written about sort of kind of how overtaxed, in particular, that sort of section of CBER feels, and how they're probably going to be getting new resources as part of the new user fee iteration when that gets renewed.
Yeah, absolutely. The cell and gene therapy area is one that's expected to, really take off in the next few years, and they're trying to plan for that. But yeah, it's another aspect of this is that they can't hire people fast enough, and to kind of make things go quicker. And even if they did have this, they were fully staffed up, there are things about cell and gene therapies that just don't want to go fast as much as we would like them to. So. Well, that's all for this week. For more, check out our website at www.thepinksheet.com. You can also find this and previous podcast episodes on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, SoundCloud, and Spotify by searching for Pharma Intelligence. And if you're so inclined, feel free to give us a review. Thanks again for listening to the Pink Sheet Pharma Regulatory Podcast. I'm Derek Gingery with Sarah Carlin Smith and Matt Hobbs. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.